Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. I hope you enjoy that first segment. I'm very much looking forward to the start of the college football season. Before we transition to the win projection previews for some teams that I really like, I do want to remind you yet again to like, follow, and subscribe to the show on the network, and also consider leaving a tip or donation at the link gsmc.cloud. There's a huge support to all at the network and will be greatly appreciated by me as well. If you have any burning questions, comments, or concerns about the show at large, you can also put them there, and they will be addressed and answered at the beginning of the next episode. Without further ado, let's jump into what I believe will be some pretty exciting segments. We're going to be looking at some teams and their win projections and how they profile. And so, I want to start off with a team that is kind of in a rebuilding process, which is surprising considering that they were a CFP finalist. Yes, I am talking about the Washington Huskies. The Washington Huskies last year were an offensive juggernaut centered around the play of Michael Penix Jr. and his three-headed wide receiver duo in Rome Odunze, Jalen McMillan, and Jalen Polk. All four of those guys are gone offensively. In fact, only 8 of 32 players with at least 300 snaps return to this Washington Huskies team. Now, the reason they're in transition is not just on the field, but off the field as well. They move from the Pac-12, where parity was key, to a much more competitive Big Ten conference, where they will certainly have some growing pains if they don't process quickly. Let's talk about the new look Washington Huskies. Not only are Michael Penix Jr. and his three-headed monster at the wide receiver position gone, they have a new head coach, Kalen DeBoer, leaving to take the Alabama job. Big shoes to fill following Nick Saban. They replace him with Jedd Fisch, a young, exciting, up-and-coming coach out of Arizona, led them to a top 25 finish. And they also needed a new look at QB. So what do? They pick up one of the more experienced, albeit more serviceable kind of QB in Will Rogers. Definitely not as electrifying as Michael Penix was, but he gets the job done. And perhaps that's what Washington needs in this kind of transitional year. Let's go to the defensive side of the ball. Lost a lot of production. However, their biggest strengths lie in both the linebacker and secondary positions. They return Cam Fabiculannan for his senior year, fantastic player at the safety position. They return Carson Bruner at the linebacker position. Both of these players had 75 plus PFF ratings. You also bring in a lot of depth. Cornerback Eli Jackson, Alfonso Tupolato returns as well. And Jeremiah Hunter is going to be your leading receiver at the wide receiver position. No more Rome Odunze. Jeremiah Hunter will be tasked. Had a decent season last year, 700 yards, I believe 7 touchdowns. Very impressive for someone who is not necessarily a star in that wide receiver group. So there's faith in knowing for Will Rogers, a guy who's going to have to live up to huge expectations for this Washington Huskies program due to the fact they place a lot of weight on his transfer. It's faith in knowing that Jeremiah Hunter at least had a decent season. But the rest of this roster is very young and inexperienced. And thus, that's why I believe that odds makers right now had them at only 8.1 projected wins. They have the 26th strength of schedule. Not terrible, but certainly something to look at in terms of how certain wins on their schedule will play out if they should be in the conversation to make the CFP. But looking at their schedule this morning, I definitely feel like they can hit the over if Will Rogers is just serviceable. I look at their first couple of games on the ESPN app right now. Weber State, Eastern Michigan, Washington State, Northwestern, Rutgers. Most of them at home. In fact, 4 of them at home. Those are 5 easy wins to start their season. Now they can just get through that schedule. They have 5 easy wins. They're 5-0, And then that's where it gets kind of tough. Week 6, they play Michigan, their first big, true test in Big Ten play. They do play Rutgers before Michigan, but Rutgers they should get past. Then I'm looking at 3 weeks after. They're home to USC. Always a big game for the Washington Huskies. In the Pac-12, now in the Big Ten, it's going to have a lot, much more meaning. Should the Washington Huskies get past Michigan, their first true test? And I feel like they can't. Michigan also has a lot of questions. Who's going to be their quarterback? So the Washington Huskies at least have faith in knowing that they have certain positions that other Big Ten teams are not solid at. USC, I feel like, is going to be the matchup that will most define this Washington team. Because should Miller Moss at that point have fully settled in at USC, this is going to be a very high-profile game for a lot of people. And at this point, like I said, if Washington is undefeated, this is the true marker of what will make them fantastic. Then, after that, we're looking at a road game against Penn State. It's always tough to go to that stadium, Beaver Stadium, one of the most electric atmospheres in not just college football, but in all of sports. All of those Penn State fans are going to be rowdy for that one. And then you're at home to UCLA. Should be an easy win. And then the big game to end out the year against Oregon. That one on the road at Autzen Stadium. So, at the end of the day, when I look at this Washington schedule, it's not as daunting as people think. Transitioning to the Big Ten could have been a much more difficult task. And I feel like they got the nice end of the stick. They didn't get the short end of the stick here. They miss out on Ohio State, which could be integral. Should they pass all these tests and get to the Big Ten championship game, even if they lose, they could still represent the Washington, the Big Ten outside of, say, an Ohio State in the CFP. But let's not get past wishful thinking here. Let's still look at this team. When you think about not just the players that Kalen DeBoer had at his disposal, but the culture that they were able to create, the reason why it's one of the top scoring offenses last year, I believe third in scoring points average per game for Washington last year, is because Michael Penix was otherworldly. He understood what was required of him, and he understood the assignment every single week. I can't necessarily say the same about Will Rogers. Coming out of Mississippi State, certainly not the highest profile team. Certainly learning under Michael Leach, may he rest in peace, one of the great head coaches of all time. Obviously, being in that kind of Mike Leach air raid system should help him make this transition. But it's also about how Jedd Fisch is also making this transition. Jedd Fisch, obviously, last year Arizona, kind of happened upon Noah Fafita and Tetairoa McMillan. Fantastic wide receiver QB duo there. He's going to have to find a way to get a QB that might not be as comfortable with a deep ball to really open up this offense. Because that's what I think that Jedd Fisch was hired for. The continuity factor. You're losing someone in Kalen DeBoer who is willing to fling the ball downfield. You're losing also OC Ryan Grubb to the Seattle Seahawks, which I'm really excited for as a Seahawks fan. But getting back to Washington, you lose that. So Jedd Fisch really has the kind of feel of him similar to Kalen DeBoer. Now, let's look at the production that they lost, because they obviously lost a lot. Losing all three of your big wide receivers has to hurt. It has to. Because for Will Rogers coming into this new environment, much like several other quarterbacks, like it talks about Riley Leonard, you really want to have someone who might have had continuity and experience in this offense. Jeremiah Hunter brings that. But then after that, this is a very young, inexperienced wide receiver room that is really going to have to step up in certain situations. And so, looking at players like Jace Burton, Luke Gayton, guys who are just coming into this program, can they really be up to par? And so, even when you look at the schedule, even when you look at the games in hindsight, you also have to consider the fact that this is not the same Washington that it was last year. This is not the same Washington that's going to fling the ball down the field and have all three of their receivers be excellent at catching it. And so, I really think that this win projection total is too low. There is talent here on this Washington roster that could shock people, but is it enough to carry over and translate to big wins? Oregon has continuity. Even though they have a new quarterback in Dylan Gabriel, they have continuity. USC, a little bit of continuity. They still have Lincoln Riley, and he might be the best coach when it comes to quarterbacks. Thank God you avoid Ohio State, who they have their own QB questions, but I think they're in a better place for continuity as well. And so, looking at Washington, not just in the context of the Pac-12, but now the Big Ten, things are going to get a lot more serious for them. And Will Rogers is a guy who I'm really going to have to keep my eye on to see how he improves as the season goes on. And he's also just probably a one-year rental. This isn't a guy who is going to stay in this QB room for some time. You're going to have to figure out after him who's going to come after him. So the future is kind of murky for the Washington Huskies right now. But looking at the schedule, there are definitely some places where they can pick up crucial, pivotal Big Ten wins and maybe find themselves as a sneaky dark horse contender to make the CFP as one of those teams that might lose its Big Ten championship game but can find a way in. And that'll just about do it for this segment. Coming next, we go from a dark horse to a juggernaut. Georgia we'll be talking about and how they will be definitely in the conversation for the CFP. We'll be right back to discuss them.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available.